Again, how romantically misleading are the lyrical accounts of the Middle Ages, with which many contemporary theorists of social relations adorn their works. Membership in a guild, manorial, estate, or village protected medieval man throughout his life and gave him peace and serenity, protected him from what, we may ask? Certainly not from remorseless bullying at the hands of his superiors. And along with all that peace and serenity, there was throughout the Middle Ages an enormous amount of chronic frustration, acute unhappiness, and a passionate resentment against the rigid, hierarchical system that permitted no vertical movement up the social ladder. And for those who were bound to the land, a very little horizontal movement in space. The impersonal forces of overpopulation and over-organization, and the social engineers who are trying to direct these forces, are pushing us in the direction of a new medieval system. This revival will be made more acceptable than the original by such brave New Worldian amenities as infant conditioning, sleep teaching, and drug-induced euphoria. But for the majority of men and women, it will still be a kind of servitude. Four, propaganda in a democratic society. The doctrines of Europe, Jefferson wrote, were that men in numerous associations cannot be restrained within the limits of order and justice, except by forces physical and moral wielded over them by authorities independent of their will. We, the founders of the new American democracy, believe that man was a rational animal endowed by nature with rights and with an innate sense of justice, and that he could be restrained from wrong and protected in right by moderate powers confided to persons of his own choice, and held to their duties by dependence on his own will. To post-Freudian heirs, the kind of language seems touchingly quaint and ingenuous. Human beings are a good deal less rational and innately just than the optimist of the 18th century supposed. On the other hand, they are neither so morally blind nor so hopelessly unreasonable as the pessimists of the 20th would have us believe. In spite of the id and the unconscious, in spite of endemic neuroses and the prevalence of low IQs, most men and women are probably decent enough and sensible enough to be trusted with the direction of their own destinies. Democratic institutions are devices for reconciling social order with individual freedom and initiative, and for making the immediate power of a country's rulers subject to the ultimate power of the ruled. Again, democratic institutions are devices for reconciling social order with individual freedom and initiative, and for making the immediate power of a country's rulers subject to the ultimate power of the ruled. The fact that in Western Europe and America these devices have worked, all things considered, not too badly, is proof enough that the 18th century optimists were not entirely wrong. Given a fair chance, human beings can govern themselves, and govern themselves better, though perhaps with less mechanical efficiency, than they can be governed by authorities independent of their will. Given a fair chance, I repeat, for the fair chance is an indispensable prerequisite, no people that passes abruptly from a state of subservience under the rule of a despot to the completely unfamiliar state of political independence can be said to have a fair chance of making democratic institutions work. Again, no people in a precarious economic condition has a fair chance of being able to govern itself democratically. Liberalism flourishes in an atmosphere of prosperity and declines as declining prosperity makes it necessary for the government to intervene ever more frequently and drastically in the affairs of its subjects. Overpopulation and overorganization are two conditions which I have already pointed out, deprive a society of a fair chance of making democratic institutions work effectively. We see, then, that there are certain historical, economic, demographic, and technological conditions which make it very hard for Jefferson's rational animals, endowed by nature with inalienable rights and an innate sense of justice, to exercise their reason, claim their rights, and act justly within a democratically organized society. We in the West have been supremely fortunate in having been given our fair chance of making the great experiment in self-government. Unfortunately, it now looks as though, owing to recent changes in our circumstances, this infinitely precious fair chance were being, little by little, taken away from us. And this, of course, is not the whole story. These blind, impersonal forces are not the only enemies of individual liberty and democratic institutions. There are also forces of another, less abstract character, forces that can be deliberately used by power-seeking individuals whose aim is to establish partial or complete control over their fellows. 50 years ago, when I was a boy, it seemed completely self-evident that the bad old days were over, that torture and massacre, slavery, and the persecution of heretics were things of the past. Among people who wore top hats, traveled in trains, and took a bath every morning, such horrors were simply out of the question. After all, we were living in the 20th century. A few years later, these people who took daily baths and went to church in top hats were committing atrocities on a scale undreamed of by the benighted Africans and Asiatics. In the light of recent history, it would be foolish to suppose that this sort of thing cannot happen again. It can, and no doubt it will. But in the immediate future, there is some reason to believe that the punitive methods of 1984 will give place to the reinforcements and manipulations of Brave New World. There are two kinds of propaganda: rational propaganda in favor of action that is consonant with the enlightened self-interest of those who make it, and those to whom it is addressed, and non-rational propaganda is not consonant with anybody's enlightened self-interest, but is dictated by and appeals to passions, blind impulses, unconscious cravings, or fears. Where the actions of individuals are concerned, there are motives more exalted than enlightened self-interest. But where collective action has to be taken in the fields of politics and economics, enlightened self-interest is probably the highest of effective motives. If politicians and their constituents always acted to promote their own or their country's long-range self-interest, this world would be an earthly paradise. As it is, they often act against their own interest, merely to gratify their least credible passions. The world, in consequence, is a place of misery. Propaganda in favor of action, that is consonant with enlightened self-interest, appeals to reason by means of logical arguments based upon the best available evidence fully and honestly set forth. Propaganda in favor of action dictated by the impulses that are below self-interest offers false, garbled, or incomplete evidence, avoids logical argument, and seeks to influence its victims by the mere repetition of catchwords, free, free, by the furious denunciation of foreign or domestic scapegoats, and by cunningly associating the lowest passions with the highest ideals. so that atrocities are perpetuated in the name of God, and the most cynical kind of realpolitik becomes a matter of religious principle and patriotic duty. In John Dewey's words, a renewal of faith in common human nature, in its potentialities in general, and its power in particular to respond to reason and truth, is a surer bulwark against totalitarianism and the demonstration of material success or a devout worship of special legal and political forms. The power to respond to reason and truth exists in all of us, but so, unfortunately, does the tendency to respond to unreason and falsehood, particularly in those cases where the falsehood evokes some enjoyable emotion, or where the appeal to unreason strikes some answering chord in the primitive, subhuman depths of our being. In certain fields of activity, men have learned to respond to reason and truth pretty consistently. The authors of learned articles do not appeal to the passions of their fellow scientists and technologists. They set for what, to the best of their knowledge, is the truth about some particular aspect of reality. They use reason to explain the facts they have observed, and they support their points of view with arguments that appeal to reason in other people. All this is fairly easy in the fields of physical science and technology. It is much more difficult in the fields of politics and religion and ethics. Here the relevant facts often elude us. As for the meaning of the facts, that of course depends upon the particular system of ideas in terms of which you choose to interpret them. And these are not the only difficulties that confront the rational truth seeker. In public and in private life, it often happens that there is simply no time to collect the relevant facts or to weigh their significance. We are forced to act on insufficient evidence and by a light considerably less steady than that of logic. With the best will in the world, we cannot always be completely truthful or consistently rational. All that is in our power is to be as truthful and rational as circumstances permit us to be, and to respond as well as we can to the limited truth and imperfect reasonings offered for our consideration by others. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, said Jefferson, it expects what never was and never will be. The people cannot be safe without information. Where the press is free and every man able to read, all is safe. Across the Atlantic, another passionate believer in reason was thinking, about the same time in almost precisely similar terms. Here is what John Stuart Mill wrote of his father, the utilitarian philosopher James Mill. So complete was his reliance upon the influence of reason over the minds of mankind whenever it is allowed to reach them, that he felt as if all would be gained if the whole population were able to read, and if all sorts of opinions were allowed to be addressed to them by word or in writing, and if by the suffrage they could nominate a legislature to give effect to the opinions they had adopted, all is safe. All would be gained. Once more, we hear the note of 18th century optimism. Jefferson, it is true, was a realist as well as an optimist. He knew by bitter experience that the freedom of the press can be shamefully abused. Nothing, he declared, can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. And yet, he insisted, and we can only agree with him, within the pale of truth, the press is a noble institution, equally the friend of science and civil liberty. Mass communication, in a word, is neither good nor bad. It is simply a force, and like any other force, it can be used either well or ill. Used in one way, the press, the radio, and the cinema are indispensable to the survival of democracy. Used in another way, they are among the most powerful weapons in the dictator's armory. In the field of mass communications, as in almost every other field of enterprise, technological progress has hurt the little man and helped the big man. As lately as 50 years ago, every democratic country could boast of a great number of small journals and local newspapers. Thousands of country editors expressed thousands of independent opinions. Somewhere or other, almost anybody could get almost anything printed. Today, the press is still legally free, but most of the little papers have disappeared. The cost of wood pulp, of modern printing machinery, and of syndicated news is too high for the little man. In the totalitarian East, there is political censorship, and the media of mass communication are controlled by the state. In the democratic West, there is economic censorship, and the media of mass communication are controlled by members of the power elite. Censorship, by rising cost and concentration of communication power in the hands of a few big concerns, is less objectionable than state ownership and government propaganda. But certainly, it is not something of which a Jeffersonian Democrat could possibly approve. In regard to propaganda, the early advocates of universal literacy and a free press envisaged only two possibilities. The propaganda might be true, or it might be false. They did not foresee what in fact has happened, above all in our Western capitalist democracies, the development of a vast mass communications industry, concerned in the main neither with the true nor the false, but with the unreal, the more or less totally irrelevant. In a word, they failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In the past, most people never got a chance of fully satisfying their appetite. They might long for distractions, but the distractions were not provided. Christmas came but once a year. Feasts were solemn and rare. There were few readers and very little to read, and the nearest approach to a neighborhood motive theater was the parish church, where the performances, though frequent, were somewhat monotonous. For conditions even remotely comparable to those now prevailing, we must return to imperial Rome, where the populace was kept in good humor by frequent gratuitous doses of many kinds of entertainment, from poetical dramas to gladiatorial fights, from recitations of Virgil to all-out boxing, from concerts to military reviews and public executions. But even in Rome there was nothing like the non-stop distraction now provided by newspapers and magazines, by radio, television, and the cinema. In Brave New World, non-stop distractions of the most fascinating nature, the feelies, orgy-porgy, centrifugal, bumble-puppy, are deliberately used as instruments of policy, for the purpose of preventing people from paying too much attention to the realities of the social and political situation. The other world of religion is different from the other world of entertainment, but they still resemble one another in being most decidedly not of this world. Both are distractions, and if lived in to continuously, both can become, in Marx's phrase, the opium of the people, and so a threat to freedom. Only the vigilant can maintain their liberties, and only those who are constantly and intelligently on the spot can hope to govern themselves effectively by democratic procedures. A society, most of whose members spend a great part of their time not on the spot, not here and now, and in a calculable future, but somewhere else, in the irrelevant other worlds of sport and soap opera, of mythology and metaphysical fantasy, will find it hard to resist the encroachments of those who would manipulate and control it. In their propaganda, today's dictators rely for the most part on repetition, suppression, and rationalization, the repetition of catchwords, which they wish to be accepted as true, the suppression of facts, which they wish to be ignored, the arousal and rationalization of passions which may be used in the interest of the party or the state. As the art and science of manipulation come to a better understood, the dictators of the future will doubtless learn to combine these techniques with the non-stop distractions which, in the West, are now threatening to drown in a sea of irrelevance the rational propaganda essential to the maintenance of individual liberty and the survival of democratic institutions. Five, propaganda under a dictatorship. At his trial after the Second World War, Hitler's Minister for Armaments, Albert Speer, delivered a long speech in which, with remarkable acuteness, he described the Nazi tyranny and analyzed its methods. Hitler's dictatorship, he said, differed in one fundamental point from all its predecessors in history. It was the first dictatorship in the present period of modern technical development, a dictatorship which made complete use of all technical means for the domination of its own country. Through technical devices like the radio and the loudspeaker, 80 million people were deprived of independent thought. It was thereby possible to subject them to the will of one man. Earlier dictators needed highly qualified assistants, even at the lowest level, men who could think and act independently. The totalitarian system in the period of modern technical development can dispense with such men. Thanks to modern methods of communication, it is possible to mechanize the lower leadership. As a result of this, there has arisen a new type of uncritical recipient of orders. In the brave new world of my prophetic fable, technology had advanced far beyond the point it had reached in Hitler's day. Consequently, the recipients of orders were far less critical than their Nazi counterparts, far more obedient to the order-given elite. Moreover, they had been genetically standardized and postnatally conditioned to perform their subordinate functions, and could therefore be depended upon to behave almost as predictably as machines. As we shall see in a later chapter, this conditioning of the lower leadership is already going on under the communist dictatorships. The Chinese and the Russians are not relying merely on the indirect effects of advancing technology. They are working directly on the psychophysical organisms of their lower leaders, subjecting minds and bodies to a system of ruthless and, from all accounts, highly effective conditioning. Many a man, said Speer, has been haunted by the nightmare that one day nations might be dominated by technical means. That nightmare was almost realized in Hitler's totalitarian system. Almost, but not quite. The Nazis did not have time, and perhaps did not have the intelligence and the necessary knowledge to brainwash and condition their lower leadership. This, it may be, is one of the reasons why they failed. Since Hitler's day, the armory of technical devices at the disposal of the would-be dictator has been considerably enlarged, as well as the radio, the loudspeaker, the moving picture camera, and the rotary press. The contemporary propagandist can make use of television to broadcast the image as well as the voice of his client, and can record both image and voice on spools of magnetic tape. Thanks to the technological progress, Big Brother can now be almost as omnipresent as God. Thanks to the technological progress, Big Brother can now be almost as omnipresent as God. Nor is it only on the technical front that the hand of the would-be dictator has been strengthened. Since Hitler's day, a great deal of work has been carried out in those fields of applied psychology and neurology, which are the special province of the propagandist, the indoctrinator, and the brainwasher. In the past, these specialists in the art of changing people's minds were empiricists. By a method of trial and error, they had worked out a number of techniques and procedures, which they used very effectively, without, however, knowing precisely why they were effective. Today, the art of mind control is in process of becoming a science. The practitioners of this science know what they are doing and why. They are guided in their work by theories and hypotheses solidly established on the massive foundation of experimental evidence. Thanks to the new insights and the new techniques made possible by these insights, the nightmare that was all but realized in Hitler's totalitarian system may soon be completely realizable. But before we discuss these new insights and techniques, let us take a look at the nightmare that so nearly came true in Nazi Germany. What were the methods used by Hitler and Goebbels for depriving 80 million people of independent thought and subjecting them to the will of one man? And what was the theory of human nature upon which those terrifyingly successful methods were based? These questions can be answered, for the most part, in Hitler's own words. And what remarkably clear and astute words they are. When he writes about such vast abstractions as race, history, and providence, Hitler is strictly unreadable. But when he writes about the German masses and the methods he used for dominating and directing them, his style changes. Nonsense gives place to sense, bombast to a hard-boiled and cynical lucidity. In his philosophical lucubrations, Hitler was either cloudily daydreaming or reproducing other people's half-baked notions. In his comments on crowds and propaganda, he was writing of things he knew by first-hand experience. In the words of his all-best biographer, Mr. Alan Bullock, Hitler was the greatest demagogue in history. Those who add only a demagogue fail to appreciate the nature of political power in an age of mass politics. As he himself said, to be a leader means to be able to move the masses. Hitler's aim was first to move the masses, and then, having pried them loose from their traditional loyalties and moralities, to impose upon them, with the hypnotized consent of the majority, a new authoritarian order of his own devising. Hitler, wrote Hermann Rauschning in 1939, has a deep respect for the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order, not because of their Christian doctrine, but because of the machinery they have elaborated and controlled, their hierarchical system, their extremely clever tactics, their knowledge of human nature, and their wise use of human weakness in ruling over believers. Ecclesiasticism without Christianity, the discipline of a monastic rule, not for God's sake or in order to achieve personal salvation, but for the sake of the state and for the greater glory and power of the demagogue turned leader. This was the goal towards which the systematic moving of the masses was to lead. Let us see what Hitler thought of the masses he moved and how he did the moving. The first principle from which he started was a value judgment. The masses are utterly contemptible. They are incapable of abstract thinking and uninterested in any fact outside the circle of their immediate experience. Their behavior is determined not by knowledge and reason, but by feelings and unconscious drives. It is in these drives and feelings that the roots of their positive as well as their negative attitudes are implanted. To be successful, a propagandist must learn how to manipulate these instincts and emotions. The driving force which has brought about the most tremendous revelations on the earth has never been a body of scientific teaching which has gained power over the masses, but always a devotion which has inspired them, and often a kind of hysteria which has urged them into action. Whoever wishes to win over the masses must know the key that will open the door of their hearts, in post-Freudian jargon, of their unconscious. Hitler made this his strongest appeal to these members of the lower middle classes, who had been ruined by the inflation of 1923, and then ruined all over again by the Depression of 1929 and the following years. The masses of whom he speaks were these bewildered, frustrated, and chronically anxious millions. To make them more mass-like, more homogeneously subhuman, he assembled them by the thousands and the tens of thousands in vast halls and arenas where individuals could lose their personal identity, even their elementary humanity, and be merged with the crowd. A man or woman makes direct contact with society in two ways: as a member of some familial, professional, or religious group, or as a member of a crowd. Groups are capable of being as moral and intelligent as the individuals who form them. A crowd is chaotic, has no purpose of its own, and is capable of anything except intelligent action and realistic thinking. Assembled in a crowd, people lose their powers of reasoning and their capacity for moral choice. Their suggestibility is increased to the point where they cease to have any judgment or will of their own. They become very collective. They become very excitable. They lose all sense of individual or collective responsibility. They are subject to sudden accesses of rage, enthusiasm, and panic. In a word, a man in a crowd behaves as though he had swallowed a large dose of some powerful intoxicant. He is a victim of what I have called herd poisoning. Like alcohol, herd poisoning is an active, extroverted drug. The crowd, intoxicated, individual escapes from responsibility, intelligence, and morality into a kind of frantic animal mindlessness. During his long career as an agitator, Hitler had studied the effects of herd poison and had learned how to exploit them for his own purposes. He had discovered that the orator can appeal to those hidden forces which motivate men's actions much more effectively than can the writer. Reading is a private, not a collective activity. The writer speaks only to individuals, sitting by themselves in a state of normal sobriety. The orator speaks to masses of individuals, already well primed with herd poison. They are at his mercy, and if he knows his business, he can do what he likes with them. As an orator, Hitler knew his business supremely well. He was able, in his own words, to follow the lead of the great mass in such a way that from the living emotion of his hearers, the apt word which he needed would be suggested to him, and in its turn, this would go straight to the heart of its hearers. Otto Strasser called him a loudspeaker, proclaiming the most secret desires, the least admissible instincts, the sufferings, the personal revolts of a whole nation. 20 years before Madison Avenue embarked upon motivational research, Hitler was systematically exploring and exploiting the secret fears and hopes, the cravings, anxieties, and frustrations of the German masses. It is by manipulating hidden forces that the advertising experts induce us to buy their wares: a toothpaste, a brand of cigarettes, a political candidate. And it was by appealing to the same hidden forces and to others too dangerous for Madison Avenue to meddle with, that Hitler induced the German masses to buy themselves a Führer, an insane philosophy, and the Second World War. Unlike the masses, intellectuals have a taste for rationality and an interest in facts. Their critical habit of mind makes them resistant to the kind of propaganda that works so well on the majority. Among the masses, instinct is supreme, and from instinct comes faith. While the healthy common folk instinctively close their ranks to form a community of the people. Under a leader, it goes without saying, intellectuals run this way and that, like hens in a poultry yard. With them, one cannot make history. They cannot be used as elements composing a community. Intellectuals are the kind of people who demand evidence and are shocked by logical inconsistencies and fallacies. They regard oversimplification as the original sin of the mind and have no use for the slogans, the unqualified assertions, and sweeping generalizations which are the propagandist's stock in trade. All effective propaganda, Hitler wrote, must be confined to a few bare necessities, and then must be expressed in a few stereotyped formulas. These stereotyped formulas must be constantly repeated, for only constant repetition will finally succeed in imprinting an idea upon the memory of a crowd. Philosophy teaches us to feel uncertain about the things that seem to us self-evident. Propaganda, on the other hand, teaches us to accept as self-evident matters about which it would be reasonable to suspend our judgment or to feel doubt. The aim of the demagogue is to create social coherence under his own leadership. But as Bertrand Russell has pointed out, systems of dogma without empirical foundations, such as scholasticism, Marxism, and fascism, have the advantage of producing a great deal of social coherence among their disciples. The demagogic propagandist must therefore be consistently dogmatic. All his statements are made without qualification. There are no grays in his picture of the world. Everything is either diabolically black or celestially white. In Hitler's words, the propagandist should adopt a systematically one-sided attitude towards every problem that has to be dealt with. He must never admit that he might be wrong or that people with a different point of view might be even partially right. Opponents should not be argued with. They should be attacked, shouted down, or if they become too much of a nuisance, liquidated. The morally squeamish intellectual may be shocked by this kind of thing, but the masses are always convinced that right is on the side of the active aggressor. Such, then, was Hitler's opinion of humanity in the mass. It was a very low opinion. Was it also an incorrect opinion? The tree is known by its fruits, and a theory of human nature which inspired the kind of techniques that proved so horribly effective must contain at least an element of truth. Virtue and intelligence belong to human beings as individuals freely associating with other individuals in small groups. So do sin and stupidity, but the subhuman mindlessness to which the demagogue makes his appeal, the moral imbecility on which he relies when he goads his victims into action, are characteristics not of men and women as individuals, but of men and women in masses. Mindlessness and moral idiocy are not characteristically human attributes. They are symptoms of herd poisoning. In all the world's higher religions, salvation and enlightenment are for individuals. The kingdom of heaven is within the mind of a person, not within the collective mindlessness of a crowd. Christ promise to be present where 2 or 3 are gathered together. He did not say anything about being present where thousands are intoxicating one another with herd poison. Under the Nazis, enormous numbers of people were compelled to spend an enormous amount of time marching in serried ranks from point A to point B and back again to point A. This keeping of the whole population on the march seemed to be a senseless waste of time and energy. Only much later, adds Hermann Rauschning, was there revealed in it a subtle intention based on a well-judged adjustment of ends and means. Marching diverts men's thoughts. Marching kills thought. Marching makes an end of individuality. Marching is the indispensable magic stroke performed in order to accustom the people to a mechanical, quasi-ritualistic activity until it becomes second nature. From his point of view, and at the level where he had chosen to do his dreadful work, Hitler was perfectly correct in his estimate of human nature. To those of us who look at men and women as individuals rather than as members of crowds or of regimented collectives, he seems hideously wrong. In an age of accelerating overpopulation, of accelerating over-organization, and ever more efficient means of mass communication, how can we preserve the integrity and reassert the value of the human individual? This is a question that can still be asked and perhaps effectively answered. A generation from now, it may be too late, and it certainly is, to find an answer, and perhaps impossible, in the stifling collective climate of that future time, even to ask the question. And just a personal footnote as we wrap up Chapter 5. It's important to notice that these writings took place in the late 50s, around 1958.